second session of today is titled Tracing the Past, Navigating the Present, and Shaping the Future of TFGBV, of the TFGBV movement. And really, it's self-explanatory what we want with the session. We really want to celebrate what we have achieved this far, but also to critically assess where we are right now, what's needed right now, and be able to look forward and plan ahead, really not only based on the context and the technologies that we have now, but the emerging ones, and be prepared for what's coming. So I think it's also important to say that the kind of agenda that we want to be discussing here together is one that is based on the expertise, the experience of survivors, one that centers intersectionality, and one that really recognizes the agency of women, not only as like those that are inputting into how we create safer spaces, but those that are building safer spaces as technologists, as developers. So this is a conversation we are going to have as part of this first panel. And for that, let me invite the panelists of session 2. And when I call you, please come and join me at the stage. Paloma Lara-Castro is the Director of Policy, Public Policy and Digital Rights. Hello, Paloma, at Derechos Digitales. Paloma has been researching gender-related issues and technology, and she represents Derechos Digitales in a number of global policy spaces. Welcome. I would like to welcome Ayesha. Ayesha will be joining us online. Is she there already? Hi, Ayesha. Ayesha Mago is SVRI's Global Advocacy Director. She has worked for more than 2 decades as a feminist researcher, activist, and trainer. And at SVRI, today she leads the TFGBV portfolio. She also works more broadly on influencing change towards equitable and sustainable funding, practice, and policy in the field. Welcome again, Ayesha. And finally, but certainly not least, Kathryn Kosmides, who is joining us here, is entrepreneur, a tech entrepreneur who sits at the board of Chayn. And she founded in 2018 Garbo, which is a tech nonprofit on a mission to help proactively prevent harm in the digital age through technology. Welcome. And although we'll be having a conversation here at the stage with our speakers, before that, we really want to invite you to participate with us in the construction of the discussions of this morning. We want to put together a timeline of the benchmarks of the past 30 years of activism around TFGBV. And we'll build that inviting you to participate in a survey, an online survey. And I'll pass now the word to my colleague Francia, who will tell you a little bit how this will work. And then we will engage and continue the conversation with the panel. And we invite the panelists to also answer the survey if you have any devices there with you. Francia?
Hello all, good morning. I will be sharing with you a screen. If you can all confirm, please, that you can see it correctly.
Not yet. Yes.
Can you all see it now?
Yes.
All right, for the following activity, we will be asking everyone to please join us at this Mentimeter site. So there are several options. You can either scan the QR code or log in directly on your phone to menti.com and insert the following code 71211035. And as soon as everyone is ready, we can see the next slide. I will give everyone just a few seconds to join us. The link to Menti and the code are both available on the chat too for anyone that needs it. And Paula, can you please confirm if people around you are giving signs of being able to log in. Is everyone ready?
Everything okay? Yes, everything okay here, Francia. Thank you.
Incredible. So for the first question, you can find it here. We will be asking you to please share a transformative milestone that you consider significant in the technology-facilitated gender-based violence movement. If possible, please also include the year and the region or country along with the milestone. And okay, so now I will be giving you access to responding. Please, everyone share a milestone that you consider transformative in the TFGBV movement.
And just to clarify, all the participants online are also assessing the survey.
Okay, the answers are starting to come in. And with this milestone that you'll be sharing, keep it in mind, please, for the next question that we will be presenting. Okay, we still have answers coming in. So we're giving a few more seconds. Oh, and I didn't specify, but yes, feel free to share your answer in your language. We're having answers coming in Spanish and French, so that is amazing. It's no problem at all. All right. We still have answers coming in, Paula, so let me know when you want me to move forward or if we should allow for a little more time.
Let's use the room here to check on the temperature. Are you done? Can we move to the second question? I think we can, Francia. It's only 2 questions. So
yes, it's only 2 questions.
So let's go to the second one, please.
Perfect. Okay, so moving on. So based on the milestone that you just shared with us, if we can ask you now, please, in one word, describe what was the crucial thing in achieving that milestone. Examples of words can be advocacy, legislation, sweat, blood and tears, and any type of resource or effort input that you consider was fundamental or crucial for this milestone to be achieved. So moving to the options here. And it should be ready to go for you to input the one word describing what was crucial. All right, we see the answers coming in.
And we'll be working on the results. Sorry, I forgot to turn on the mic. We'll be working on the results. So let's give our colleagues a couple of minutes to put the answers together. You'll not see today the results of this first question because we have too many, we have in different languages. But what we'll be doing with the answer to the first question is to really create a timeline. And depending on the number, I'll not promise, depends on the number of answers that we have. Our plan is to put together the timeline for tomorrow to share with you. And if it's not ready for tomorrow, we for sure will be sending this to you via email to all participants so that you can also use that for your own work and advocacy. But we'll share with you the second question that's like a more contained set of answers. So we will be sharing the word cloud today, just to give you an idea, a flavor of what people shared. And Francia, let us know when you're ready.
The answers are still coming in, so if you want me to allow just a few more seconds for people to add anything they want. And just a few more moments. And thank you everyone for staying within the instructions. Everyone is doing amazing, sharing short answers, and this is precisely what we needed for the activity. Okay, so we are ready to share the results for this one. And as Paula said, we will be putting together a timeline based on the milestones that you shared first. But for the words about what has been crucial, we are ready to share now.
Expectations.
These have been your contributions. There you go.
Thank you, Francia. So advocacy as the main word, legislation, awareness, research, accountability, advocacy, legislation again. And this is just to give us a little bit of the flavor of what you shared. Thanks for bearing with us. We are going through the answers before sharing, also for security issues, yes. Because we have all those participants that are also joining us online. Apologies. And as we said, we'll be sharing more. Apologies. We'll be sharing more tomorrow or in the upcoming days. This is the result of the rain from yesterday. And now, finally, we move to the conversation with our panel. And I'll start with Ayesha, that is online. Who is online? Ayesha, let me see if you're back and you can hear us.
I am, and can you hear me clearly, Paula?
Let's just see you on the screen. Thank you. Ayesha, I'll have the first question directed to you.
Okay.
Looking at the history of the TFGBV movement, what strategies have been effective in creating change in policy and discourse?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for having me, first of all. And Paula, can you hear me clearly?
Yes, we can. Everybody on the back? Yes, thank you.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. I'm really sorry I can't be in the room there with you. It would have been great to be in New York today and tomorrow with all of you. But thank you so much for asking us, to talk on this panel, and really happy to be here. So in response to your question, I mean, of course, TFGBV, this has been on the agenda of feminist technology researchers and experts for a really long time now. But I think it's really in the last few years, and partly due to the rapid expansion of technology and access to technology, that global leaders, GBV researchers and practitioners really started to fully grasp just how widespread, severe, impactful, and damaging TFGBV really is, what a big problem it really is. And I think a lot has driven this shift. I mean, reflecting on the Mentimeter that you just had, of course, advocacy, right? Grassroots activism, awareness campaigns like APC's Take Back the Tech, these and many, many others have played a huge role in mobilizing communities to recognize and fight back against online violence. it just really made me reflect, because last week at RightsCon, we were in a session where we talked about the historicized, we mapped the history of the TFGBV movement. And it was clear at our different tables as we were mapping that for many, our first real exposure to this as even an idea came, although we didn't call it TFGBV at the time, came through public campaigns, through advocacy, in many, many countries, many, many regions, different types of grassroots campaigns. And these efforts sort of initially helped people put a name to their experiences, to recognize that others were facing the same harms, and to also understand that they were not alone, whether they were learning about this through awareness raising or through their firsthand experience. And I mean, another aspect of this, of course, is, many organizations, and I'm sure many of the people in the room or online today, have been providing digital safety advice, emotional support, legal counsel to women facing online harassment. And this work has been critical, both in addressing harm directly and also in shaping broader policy responses. So I'm thinking of organizations like the Digital Rights Foundation and Chayn and many, many others who are leading the way in this space. But because I'm from SVRI, I'm going to really focus on the evidence, because, of course, when it comes to creating change and shifting the discourse, the evidence, the research has been game-changing. And over the past decade, the evidence base on TFGBV has really grown significantly. It started sort of, maybe with frameworks just beginning to even understand or define what TFGBV is and was, and how we can start thinking about measuring it. Because after all, if we can't measure something, we can't fully understand it. This is still a huge issue and, a big obstacle that we're dealing with in the research space. And research has highlighted the many, many ways now that technology is used to perpetrate harm. And global efforts, including work from UN bodies, academic institutions, civil society organizations, these have all been crucial in documenting the scale, the patterns, the consequences, the impacts of TFGBV. And that evidence has directly shaped policy. It's influenced legal frameworks on digital abuse, corporate accountability measures for tech companies where they exist, prevention programs that integrate digital literacy and safety tools. And again, the nature of research has evolved as new forms of TFGBV have emerged. At one point it might have been online stalking. Now we're looking at doxing, we're looking at deep fakes, AI generated harms, generative AI and those harms. And we at SVRI have been funding research in this space since 2014. But again, initially around defining, measuring, testing some technology-based tools that existed to improve responses to violence. And we didn't really have the full picture back then, specifically when it came to technological dimensions of the violence. But since 2021, we have, and many other organizations have, as have, APC, for example, increasingly funded research in low and middle income countries, in communities that are most impacted, that actually digs deeper, that looks at how TFGBV manifests in specific contexts, what are specific experiences of and impacts on vulnerable groups, looking at survivors' lived experiences, looking at the use of technology in not just perpetrating harm, but where it can actually prevent and respond to online violence, and looking at some of the policy and regulatory shifts required for prevention. So I think the evidence is there. The evidence is growing. It's a big factor in shifting policy, shifting discourse. We need to use it properly. Data gaps also persist, and they persist especially in low and middle income countries. So we need to continue with this work to make digital spaces safer and more equitable for all. And maybe we'll have a chance to discuss this more later. But I just want to stress something important in this whole sort of framework of the research and data. And that is that we really need to continue to think critically about how, why, and where it's being done. As SVRI, we were founded in response to the deep inequities in the research field, particularly the lack of funding, the lack of support for research on violence in low and middle income countries, and where the burden was highest. And so while investment in evidence generation is vital, it continues to be vital, it cannot just be about producing more data. It has to be about producing that in a way that shifts power dynamics, fosters equitable partnerships, and actually really supports locally driven strategic research efforts. So yeah, just a final point on that. I think in the work to build this healthy and vibrant evidence ecosystem, generally in GBV, but so in TFGBV, it really needs to be one that amplifies the voices of those working closest to the issue. And it requires long-term investment in skills, in knowledge and networks. It's not just about funding. And we really need to think about how the evidence is gathered, because that matters. And research needs to challenge and not reinforce existing inequities, which really means creating space for diverse voices, methodologies, and insights, rather than imposing a top-down approach. So I will stop there and back to you, and hope to carry on.
Thank you so much, Ayesha. Thanks for reminding us of the role of campaigns in not only raising awareness, but in building solidarity and movement building. And of course, the role of research, evidence, documentation in shaping policy, corporate accountability, but also this critical discussion about how research is done and how data is collected. And with that, I'm gonna move to you, Paloma, to discuss with us, to share with us how you see the integration of intersectional approaches in strengthening TFGBV advocacy, and where do significant gaps remain in addressing violence experienced by marginalized communities?
Thanks, Paula. And it's great to be here with you all and to be sharing this space for such an important discussion. I think the political climate today raises more and more concerns and need to have this discussion, and really puts more value on the need to just converse among ourselves, share information, share discussions on how to advance to these discussions that really put forward an intersectional agenda right now. Because as we are advancing, like as Ayesha was mentioning, we are advancing on gathering data, on gathering evidence, on understanding the impacts of TFGBV on women, on girls, on intersecting identities. And I would like to point out just what Paula mentioned before, that we really truly must move forward the binary on women and girls, and really understand that as we're talking about a prevailing social structural issue and gender-based issue, we really do need to encompass other identities such as gender diverse identities, LGBTQI communities. Is crucial to be included within this discussion as a base to move forward, and not just stay in the same rolling circle where we don't advance towards more equitable approaches. I don't like to talk about solutions when we're talking about structural issues, but I do like to talk about approaches. So in that sense, intersectionality is a core principle for, on the one hand, to consider survivor-centric approaches, and on the other hand, to understand really the differentiated impacts of TFGBV on different communities. So in that sense, it's important not only to understand the dimension of the differentiated impacts. Is not the same to be part of one or another intersecting discriminatory category, or not to be in one, so that creates a differentiated impact, of course, but also in understanding these dimensions, we really can move to more approaches that are effective in protection, and not just check the board on legislation or not legislation, for example, which is what we're seeing now, not just globally, but in Latin America particularly, which is where I'm talking from. We are seeing that there's advancement in law protection, in law policy protection, for example, but there's not enough advancement on the inclusion of intersectionality within not only the concept of the TFGBV, but also how we're advancing on approaches and that give actually answers that are effective for these communities. So for example, what we're seeing on ground throughout different investigations we're carrying out, one of them actually with the UNFPA team regarding TFGBV guidelines on how to legislate on TFGBV, where what we're seeing in the ground is that taking into account intersectionality factors, what we're seeing is the most affected communities of this issue, as for one hand, has to do with, as I said, intersecting identities, such as LGBTQI communities, which this is something that is really important to point out, that it's not only the lack of recognition within this space of the TFGBV within policy and legislation, but also we have to take into account that for these communities, especially in Latin America, there is a lack of institutional protections beyond TFGBV. For example, there's no non-discrimination laws, or in some cases, for example, in Paraguay, where I'm from, there is no law that actually recognizes gender identities, or that recognizes how gender identities need to intersect within other policies. So these communities are very left out of institutional protections, which when we're thinking about TFGBV, sometimes when you don't have the other institutional laws in place, there's no guarantee that even within a TFGBV legislation, this will encompass other intersecting identities, such as LGBTQI communities, as we are seeing, for example, in Latin America, where there are certain legislations that recognize TFGBV, but as they don't explicitly include a diverse women or LGBTQI in general, these protections don't apply to them. This is what we're seeing very clearly on the ground, and this is very, very troubling. So as we're seeing, as we really do need to advance, not only legislatively and policy-wise, but also culturally-wise. So what we're thinking about TFGBV, how we're thinking about gender-based violence. Another prevailing issue we're seeing is the use of TFGBV to not only to harm the presence of women or people who are in leading roles, but also tend to aim to dismantle certain social fights, such as, for example, climate change. What we're seeing as the use of TFGBV towards certain human rights defenders that actually tends to impede their fight throughout other prevailing social issues beyond TFGBV and beyond gender issues. That's what we're seeing very clearly. Women in politics, women in leadership roles are being particularly affected. Then another thing that we're seeing, another trend that we're seeing is that as certain people who are excluded from social services, for example, access to social services, are compounded by TFGBV and don't actually get to be recognized that the violence they go through, for example, when within institutional processes, is actually also categorized as TFGBV, but it's not recognized as such. So there's a lot of intersecting values that not only impede the protection of these communities, but actually don't recognize their experiences within TFGBV. They're actually unique experiences that need to be taken into account when we're thinking about tailored strategies, which is what we're really lacking in policy spaces. And with this, I'm going to finish because I know I have a little time, but it's very concerning that as we're navigating this space, we're seeing that locally, as I mentioned, we are facing different obstructions to recognizing this type of violence, but we're also seeing that international spaces are not keeping up with the realities of certain countries. So for example, we're seeing one-off solutions that don't actually apply to certain nuances that need to be taken into account when we're talking about regional perspectives and also local perspectives, and intersectional is key to that matter. And also we're seeing certain omissions within new international pronouncements that actually mean that are not only invisibilizing this problematic, but also are generating setbacks in what has already been recognized in other spaces. So for example, to give a concrete example, within the Pact of the Future that was negotiated last year, there was a push for combating TFGBV, for example, but there was lots of them, but two very important exclusions. One of them is the political decision to exclude LGBTQI communities within, even that, to mention the silence within the document, going against the supposed objective of encompassing all people and not leaving anyone behind. So that, for example, is a very, very important obstacle to achieving equality. And also, for example, the exclusion of prevention of TFGBV, which I'm going to touch more based on the next question regarding this. But as the exclusion of prevention on TFGBV actually hinders the possibility of talking about structural changes within this space. So we're all talking about ex post. We're talking about what we're going to do when the violation already occurred. If we're only focusing on that, and if we're only focusing on criminal arena, and if we're leaving out differentiated impacts, we're not going to be able to generate structural change, which is what we need to combat this very troubling reality. So I'm going to leave it at that, but I hope to expand more in the next question. Thanks.
Thank you, Paloma. And try to Yeah, I'll try to highlight at the end some of the key points raised here. But at this point, just really to go back to your point about how the responses really need to be effective for the communities on the ground. And with that, I'll pass on to you, Kathryn. And we wanted now to address the backlash against gender equality that we are facing today, and really try to assess what are the strategies that have proven most effective in sustaining TFGBV advocacy, despite the hostile political environments that we are seeing today.
Yes, and again, thank you for having me here today. I think when you look at first what's been successful, and then you can kind of see the reactions to those issues. If you look globally at abortion access, which is very tangential to tech-facilitated gender-based violence, is in Chile, Argentina, Ireland. They have had success with passing legislation, movement building in these areas. And it's not seen as a political issue as much as it is in America, for example. It definitely still is, right? But I think that they're able to build this kind of cross-aisle support. And I think that's the biggest thing. We're also seeing this hugely in image-based abuse in the US. So a lot of legislation and policies and just work even by the technology platforms happening last year around this issue. Melania Trump just took that up as her issue in the White House this year. And so it's no longer seen as a leftist issue or right issue. It's seen as just an issue that's impacting people globally. And so when we look at how there's been pushback to these things, I think it's, okay, what has been successful? How have we been able to build these cross-aisle relationships and make it less about a specific community and more about how does this impact everyone? And it impacts everyone differently and uniquely in their own situations, but it is a global issue that impacts men, it impacts the LGBTQ community, older women and men, everything. And so I think that's really to combat all of the kind of fighting within it. It's trying to kind of take it broader than just the narrow individual impact these issues can have. And I think getting everyone on board also. So, you know, while technology companies, for example, have, I won't say created, but exacerbated the issue, definitely, you know, you can't just throw rocks at them, right? So it's, as Hera from Chayn will put it, it's calling in and calling out, right? And making sure that we're working together with them to keep the movement going, and just building relationships and community and advocacy work, not just with other NGOs or with legislators, but making sure that we're getting community-wide access and ensuring that we're also always being survivor-centric and focused on how they deal with the issue and the potential solutions to it.
Thank you, Kathryn, for highlighting how this is a global issue, although we do need to recognize the differentiated, impacted, and the communities that are suffering the most. And with that, I want to transition. You see that a lot of the conversation has been about the then and now. And what we want to do now is to look beyond, right? So a forward-looking discussion. And I'll go back with a second round of questions to our panelists. And in order to be able to open up for questions, I'll right away ask you two questions, and you can try to respond to very briefly, or you can choose one of them. And the first is how we can balance immediate harm reduction for survivors with long-term transformative goals, challenging the structural conditions enabling TFGBV. And the second is what you would identify as the most urgent priorities for the TFGBV movement over the next decade, particularly considering emerging technologies and the shifting digital landscapes. And I'll go around in the same order. So Ayesha, I'll invite you to start us off.
Okay, thank you. I don't know whether to try and answer both or whether to just try and answer one of those, because they're both such big questions. Just very quickly on, balancing harm reduction for survivors with longer-term transformative goals and looking at the structural conditions. I mean, I think I'll just make one point there that, we obviously do need a multi-pronged approach to that. We obviously need urgent action that, for survivors, that is oriented to the needs of survivors. We need an approach that looks at long-term transformation. We need regulation. We need ethical safeguards for whatever we're doing. But just one key point that I'll make is we obviously really need to invest in evidence-based prevention. And I think it matters to emphasize that, while there are so many aspects of TFGBV that are new, that are unfamiliar, sometimes we feel like it's an element that we don't necessarily understand. It is an extension of and a form of GBV. And like all forms, it's driven, by structural and gender inequality. And that inequality intersects with and is shaped by other systems of oppression. And I think what we know about that, the evidence that we have on the risk and protective factors a lot of them are similar to other forms of GBV. And then that evidence that we have needs to be used because we know things around how these can be addressed in different contexts. And we know, we have evidence on what works. And I think now it's time to sort of talk to each other constantly, to adapt, to scale, and really properly fund both GBV and TFGBV response and prevention programs. And of course, have strategies that challenge harmful social norms, that drive gender transformative change. Using the evidence that we have, but definitely not only, because we know that we cannot do prevention without response. We have to ensure that survivors and victims have access to the services they need across the spectrum, and that we have to do this hand in hand. So I'll stop on that now, but just one other thing. I really think part of that work is around transforming social norms in digital spaces, and there's some incredible work going on in that field now, and I'm sure other people will speak about that. In terms of your other question around the urgent priorities for tackling TFGBV over the next decade, I mean, we are looking at this from a perspective, again, of evidence gaps. What are the critical knowledge gaps that remain? What are the gaps that remain that are limiting our ability to design really effective prevention and response programs? And I'll just highlight a few key learnings that we have had from the global research agenda setting space, which we did in partnership with APC, with UN Women, and with the Global Partnership to End Online Abuse and Harassment. We co-facilitated a global research priority exercise, and it was extremely representative. It was shaped by hundreds of diverse voices from across all regions of the world, and it really centered the expertise of survivors and engaged those working directly on the issue. So a few key things that we think we need to focus on over the next many years. One thing that came up very much was, again, we need better data on prevalence, but not just generally across platforms, across contexts. What are the risk factors, both in terms of experiencing and perpetrating this form of violence? And how can we explore the social norms that are driving perpetration? We need to know much more about that. In terms of responses, a critical gap is like, what do survivors actually need and consider effective? Because too often discussions on policy and regulation are happening in silos. Survivor voices and insights into the roots of violence are not being considered. And there are other conversations, around different types of responses, restorative justice approaches, for instance, that really need to be had in the field. And it's a gap in terms of what we know. In terms of prevention, a glaring gap is around evidence-based prevention strategies in this space. So while we know a lot about what works, we don't know how exactly it works in the technological space across different cultural contexts, and what are the interventions that will really be effective to prevent perpetration in the online space, and also the critical role that tech companies play, right? So how can they really design platforms to prevent harm? How do we advocate for that? Which are the content moderation and curation strategies that actually work? Because there's lots of work being done, but not that much evaluation that we have on the impact of a lot of these programs and interventions. So we do definitely need investment in rigorous comparative research that can really identify and scale effective solutions. And then the last 2 points, and this really picks up on what Paloma was saying, and it critically was highlighted in the whole research priority setting process, obviously around differentiated impacts and about the fact that TFGBV is not just the same thing across communities. Access to solutions remains highly unequal for marginalized communities, particularly, in fact, for refugee and migrant communities and in humanitarian contexts. We need a lot more information about this. We also need really context-specific evidence that reflects people's lived realities, in order to ensure that specific interventions do meet the nuanced needs. And again, picking up on Paloma's point, a key question that came up during this process was, how does societal discrimination actually heighten the risks of experiencing TFGBV? So, for instance, for groups who have to be online, where public space is limited because of criminalization or societal stigmatization, discrimination, how does this actually increase their dependence on online platforms, for instance, for connecting with intimate partners, and therefore increase the risk of TFGBV victimization? So considering some of those very nuanced questions for specifically impacted groups. And finally, finding the safest and most ethical ways to research TFGBV. We are still missing global measurements and metrics. That makes it very difficult to compare prevention efforts across programs, which was in fact highlighted in UNFPA's 2023 report measurement. And without these, evidence-based improvements do remain limited. So, I think I'll stop there, but those are some really key things that came out in the priority setting process that we think we need to pay attention to in the next many years.
Thank you, Ayesha, and thanks in particular for highlighting that we really need to look at what TFGBV looks like in humanitarian and conflict contexts, and this is a conversation that really should be centered in the world that we are living today. And with that, I'll pass on to you, Paloma.
Thanks, Paula. Well, I'll share of the points that Ayesha has highlighted. So I'll try not to be repetitive, but just to mention that I'm just going to mention a few gaps. There are a lot of gaps that we're still identifying, but just to mention a few that relate to then priorities that we can map out, is that some of the gaps we're identifying is that the lack of recognition of TFGBV as a human rights violation and as a gender-based issue. This might sound something a bit obvious, but it's not actually something obvious that is translated to legislations or policies globally, and specifically in Latin America. We are seeing that very few legislations actually encompass TFGBV as a gender-based modality, or as a gender-based issue, and therefore as a human rights violation. So that remains a gap. Also, discussions in policy and legislation remain fragmented. That is also a very important gap. So that makes it very confusing for victims and survivors to know which legislation they can go to. Sometimes they have to go to criminal or cybercrime or data protection laws or gender-based specific law. It depends. It's very fragmented. We were seeing that as a global issue. So that makes it very hard for survivors to know which avenues are available for them. Then another gap we're finding is the over-reliance on the criminal arena to tackle this problem. And as I mentioned before, as we're talking about structural issues, we are not going to be able to solve it with just punitive legislation. That actually research we have done with APC points out that this type of legislation that is solely based on criminal arena, that doesn't take into account gender issues within this type of legislation and human rights impact of the legislation, actually end up not only being ineffective, but putting people at risk, putting women at risk and putting LGBTQI communities at risk because of the lack of consideration of the legislation. Also, this criminal sole focus, what tends to do is that it tends to aim for unbalanced perspective. So what we're seeing on the ground is that certain legislation is actually being used to criminalize critical opinions, for example, and is hindering expression, right to expression, self-expression. So that we're seeing as very important gaps. Then the third one that has already been flagged by Ayesha is the capture of corporate action within this space, right? We're seeing more and more how, and actually within this context is much and more clear, we're seeing how companies are systematically choosing profit and profit-driven initiatives over people's rights, and how they're not only providing solutions or not only providing a company to what people are denouncing, but the lack of transparency in the way they're producing algorithms that actually provide for more engagement for hateful speeches are actually being very, very damaging to communities. And there's a lack of recognition and mandatory enforcement of that need for transparency and accountability. We're seeing that there's a lot of advancements, like, for example, principles on guidance on human rights and businesses, but this is not mandatory. And as we're seeing, even though Meta actually complied initially to these principles, we're not seeing that they're actually going very, very far from them. So we do really need to focus on mandatory accountability. And in that sense, I would just like to refer to what Irene Khan mentioned in one of her last pronouncements. She said we need to focus on smart legislation. And with this, I'm going to close it up for the priorities. Smart legislation with all these encounters, going beyond the binary of we have legislation or we don't have legislation, but actually focus on how to legislate that actually puts forward balanced positions, balance of rights, or actually with the legislation protecting from TFGBV, but also protecting freedom of expression and other related rights. So that for that priority, we also need to move past the punitory aspect and encompass other multifaceted strategies that have to do with prevention and not only punitive approaches. Also, working towards survivor-centric approaches is necessary. Intersection is key, and in that sense, meaningful participation in all stages of policy is necessary to advance towards this. And finally, again, mandatory human rights impact assessments, transparency, and accountability from big tech. And in that sense, I think it would be important, not in this discussion, but further down the symposium, that we really start to think about other ways to engage online. Because as Ayesha was mentioning, this is not only a risk space right now, but it's also a space that has served for many, many years for different communities to advance on rights, to organize, to mobilize. So we really do need to take this in mind to advance towards approaches that protect women and LGBTQI communities within digital spaces. Thank you.
I second everything that both of you have said. When we look at the work that Chayn does, we help survivors in the moment, right? In 14 different languages with resources. And that's a big, huge part of our work. But we also think that movement building, policy, advocacy is also a critical piece of the work for long-term sustainability and adapting to the changes of tech-facilitated gender-based violence and just the problem holistically. So for example, yesterday, I believe we just started a research project around what is intimacy, basically, and it will then lead on to what is image-based abuse globally, because right now we think of it as kind of deep fakes, revenge porn, naked images, mostly women. But in other countries, it could just be a photo with the wrong person. It could just be maybe you are queer and someone's photoshopped you in a queer relationship that you're fully clothed. And so I think we need to explore this issue under different contexts and think about not just today and the problems that people are facing today, but the way that these problems evolve. And when we expand out to the 10-year frame point of how do these things change and what can we do to help today, I think when we look at legislation, it definitely needs to be globally encompassing as well. I know obviously there are very siloed issues in each country, each community, et cetera, but if there's a law in this country and it doesn't adapt here, but the harm is, it's also where is the perpetrator actually creating that harm, and it can be across borders. So we need across-border solutions, global solutions when we look at these issues. And the other piece on legislation, which was kind of brought up, was can this actually be used? I think we talk a lot about legislation and passing policies to criminalize, deep fakes or criminalize this. Can survivors actually use that legislation? And as someone who's had to use legislation myself, it's very, very difficult. And I'm speaking as a white, privileged American woman with access to capital. I can only imagine what a majority of people face when they actually are victims of tech facilitated gender-based violence or any form of gender-based violence. And so making sure that if we're going to pass legislation, that it can actually be utilized by survivors, that they know about it, but that they can actually, you know, take something down, or there can be consequences, things like that. So global expansion to policy and cross-border support, working with tech platforms, I think is really important. You know, as I have worked in tech and alongside tech for a majority of my career, and it's interesting, you know, Uber, for example, was big on their safety reports and transparency reports like the first year. Second year, they kind of did it, you know, and this third one was just released about 2 months ago, and you saw no press, nothing about it, right? So they kind of really hid this. And when you look at the data as well within these reports, like definitely I'm full support of transparency reports, but you also have the question of how are they calculating these numbers? What aren't they including to try and maneuver around the problem and say it's much smaller than it actually is, because it's definitely something I've seen. So as we develop transparency reports, making sure that the people reviewing those reports understand how platforms might be doing this and being able to dig into the data and infrastructure on calculating these numbers and things like that, I think will be really important.
Thank you, Kathryn, and to all the speakers. And I want to give the chance to all of you now to engage with the speakers and ask questions or make comments. And I'll start with questions in the room, and then we'll move to participation online as well. So do we have anyone in the room? And also, do we have a mic for the questions in the room? On the tables. Okay, so each table, no?
Thank you.
Okay. Amanda?
Thank you so much for the amazing presentations. My name is Amanda and I work at Equality Now. I have a question for Paloma and I guess everyone else at lunch break if you want to discuss. I work globally, but I come from the African region. And Paloma, as you've raised, we don't look at the intersection of gender. So in Africa, when we talk about gender, or when the laws or when the research is talking about gender, it's usually perceived as politically correct to do that research looking at the lens of a cisgendered woman, right? So how have you been working around that in political contexts where the governments will just refuse to accept that there is a dimension in that gender lens? So it's women and girls and nothing else.
That's an excellent, that's the answer. That's an excellent question. It's actually one of the most prevailing challenges we face when engaging with policymakers. What I think has really helped us move along is, in the one hand, the support from international pronouncements. That's very important because some countries still value their international obligations. So that's a very important part of it. Then, as I mentioned, even though in the international arena, there's a setback on the recognition of these rights. So that poses an additional challenge right now. That was a challenge that we actually predicted last year when we were discussing the GDC, and we said if this is not included, this is going to be a problem furthermore in the next year. So that is definitely a challenge. What has already worked, has also worked for us in our advocacy efforts is to work with countries who have an international commitment towards gender and towards participation in multi-stakeholder approaches. So for example, just to point out some positive examples, Chile and Mexico both are Latin American countries that have a feminist foreign policy, which is a really big milestone. We have not seen that before. So as they are, this does not mean that they are perfect and that they're carrying out everything perfectly. Just example that by having this policy, it enables us to have more participation within these spaces and to push for more of the gender inclusion agenda because they have already made that commitment. So it's important to point out that when we're talking about these issues and specifically multilateral forums, we do need to take into account that the political will is what tips of the balance. So really working with these policymakers, constantly is important, not only to focus on one specific, like for example, not only the GDC as last year, but actually working more integral within the state to be able to be more, they can turn to you and ask your advice on certain issues because they know you have been working with them on other issues as well. So that works to have a relationship that is built with these policymakers that sometimes has good results. But yeah, it's one of the most pressing challenges, which is why it's so important that civil society with UN bodies work together as well to really put this on the central agenda and keep pushing for the recognition of these rights.
We have a question over here as well.
Let me move to one question online first. Erika, or maybe Anahita?
Yeah, sure. I've got a question here. While collecting data regarding gender-based violence, participants are hesitating to share the real data. What are the strategies we can use for an accurate data collection in this aspect? And I assume they also are talking about safety and how data can be collected safely.
Is it directed to anyone in particular?
It's not, no.
No, okay. So feel free to address.
Perhaps Ayesha would like to as well.
Ayesha, do you want to start?
I mean, I think this is, sorry, I'm mute, yes, okay. Yeah, I think this is obviously, a critical issue. And that's one of the things that came up, as I was saying, in the research agenda process, that we're still asking big questions on how you can ethically and safely collect data online. What are the sorts of framework that you can put in place? And I think, we would say that any research that is conducted online, I'm assuming the questioner is asking about research being conducted online, because obviously there are various issues around there in terms of ensuring consent and privacy and all of that. But I think the key principles that I would mention are that, survivor safety and agency has to come first. And obviously privacy and your digital rights have to be protected. And I think that the key thing is that you have to be guided by the ethical standards like we are guided in any kind of gender-based violence research around ensuring things like privacy and consent and confidentiality and all of those things. And we need to keep those standards in place for any research that is happening online as well.
Yeah, that was great. That was perfect. Yeah.
And just
we only have one mic.
Just I agree to everything Ayesha has mentioned. Just one thing, that one of the obstacles we're finding in Latin America to actually generate policies that are intersectional, that are survivor-centered, and everything that we're talking about is the lack of data. So that's a really important issue being brought up, because it's one of the things that we need to move towards in order to generate the necessary data for tailored strategies in policy. So just to point out the importance of the question, yeah.
Thank you. And we can move. There was a question over there. I see a lot of hands. Let's take one more here, and then we go online again and back to the room.
Well, thank you. Hello, my name is Pamela Peralta. I am from the DIC, a civil society organization based in Paraguay. I would like to know more also, hearing you and the interesting complementary information that you provided. Also, what are the next steps towards encountering or facing this technology facilitated gender-based violence, and also the intersection on working on perpetrators, and also what the future holds towards these areas, and what other policies can we engage in with perpetrators. We do know that extensive research and policy advocacy has been focusing on victims, which is rightful so, but also how are we engaging towards undermining these conducts for perpetrators? Thank you.
Who wants to start?
I think it's a great question, because we often are and should be survivor-centered and victim-focused, but you have to look at who's causing the issues and the perpetrators. And so Jess Ladd is the founder of Callisto. She just launched the Fund to Prevent Sexual Assault, and one of her big focuses is on prevention of perpetration and perpetrator reform. We're definitely seeing gender-based violence being perpetrated younger and younger. And so interventions therefore have to be, age appropriate and reach them at a younger point, because if you're thinking that college Title IX training is going to actually prevent gender-based violence, I think you're far from like the actual issue of it. So, she's looking at some interventions in junior high age kids. How do you encompass like technology into these programs? So the video games, the programs that they're watching, using those resources. And I also think, as Paloma brought up, it can't just be for perpetrators that the criminal justice system is the only form of punishment for them. I think we do need to have a more holistic approach. Now, I am a personal believer, if I take my Chud hat off, of that. If you look at power and control based offenders, they are different from your kind of standard person who's, what I say is the crimes of desperation, right? You can murder someone out of desperation, you can steal out of desperation, but power and control based offenders act differently and have different motivations. So I definitely think we need more data on studying perpetration is huge. When we talk about we don't have data on the survivor side, we definitely lack the data on the perpetrator side, and it's much harder to gather because perpetrators don't want to be a part of these studies and say these things. So I think that if they do have, for example, like interactions with family courts or criminal courts or any sort of system, that data should be maybe required to be collected that could be utilized. So we are at least getting some of it. But it's definitely, I think that there is an area growing in this, and I hope to see more investment in it because it ultimately will help reduce and prevent harm from happening.
Quickly.
I think she covered perfectly the part of the perpetrator. To answer the first question, what is next in terms of advocacy, international advocacy wise, I think it's important to point out that GDC was approved last year, and now we're in the phase of implementation or seeing how it's going to be implemented. In that sense, it's important to point out that the principles within the GDC are very positive and actually point to a standalone objective on gender, which was actually one of the milestones we achieved with APC and UNFPA and policy, and also equity and equality and many other organizations that participated within the feminist principles that we presented within this space. So for example, that brings out a certain variety of possibilities onto how to take this principle and take it to the ground, and how do we implement this within each region and within each country. So we can take that principle to actually present it in a more nuanced and contextual perspective. Then we have the WSIS Plus 20 review this year, which is very important. And one of the things that we're actually pushing for too in that space is to have a specific line of action on gender, and that would also include TFGBV. So that is a very important space to engage with within the following months. So yeah, I'm gonna leave it at that.
Should we move to one more online? I think.
Taking one online, I think, no?
Okay, this is for Paloma, but I'm guessing anyone can answer as well. Do you feel mainstream right and tech forums sponsored by global tech firms like RightsCon are a good place to have stakeholder conversations? Or do you feel it is better to engage in a gender/intersectional forum, in brackets, acknowledging the tremendous participation at RightsCon in Costa Rica, while also acknowledging the major tech companies who fund these spaces are announcing their responsibilities for content moderation and for models that do not monetize violence?
Okay, I think that's a very, very important question. And I think that it is a question, obviously, that each organization also can take within and discuss how to better participate in different spaces. I think that as the world is configured right now, there is very little space to really not participate with companies, or to be in similar spaces or share spaces with companies, which is actually not always or not necessarily a bad thing, like for sure, because we do need to engage in conversations as well with companies. I think that is important. We do need to advance towards common practices and to engage is important. Of course, feminist spaces are really important. It's also very important to discuss, as I mentioned before, how can we keep engaging in the internet, but not just within those corporate spaces that are already taken. Like, how can we advance towards other spaces that are not concentrated within this big tech power, which is a conversation we need to have, I think. I think RightsCon has been a very good space for civil society for many, many years, and it's not just about corporate. I think it's also about civil society and engaging and talking about very important discussions and bringing out research and doing networking and engaging with different stakeholders. So I think, yeah, we do need to think about, and each organization should think about where and how to engage, but we also need to think about, again, engagement with companies at the same time that we really do need to push, again, for accountability, transparency, mandatory accountability and transparency with smart regulation. Yeah, thanks.
Can I see the hands in the room? How many we have? 2, 3, 4, 5. So I think, yeah, can we take the 4 questions, maybe? Because our time is almost over. So I think that's the best we can do. So we take all the 4 questions and the speakers try to address each or one of them.
Great. Thank you so much. Great to be here. Thank you. This is like a nice, comfortable space in chaos to be in. Really appreciate being here. I'm Katya Vogt. I work for IREX. We work on online safety and anti-TFGBV. And my question is relates to something that all of you have brought up, the importance of advocacy and all the things that need to happen, and also the need to investment in all of these things that need to happen. For me, the elephant in the room is that more than half of our anti-TFGBV work around the globe, including really deep work in 3 countries, in Kenya, Guatemala, and Georgia, has been funded by the US government. Elon Musk went on X and called out our program specifically, my tiny little program funded by USAID, as an example of wasteful because it has the word feminist in it. It's called Transform Digital Spaces to Transform to accordance to democratic and feminist principles. And so that funding is now ripped out, and that has supported all of these wonderful things we've talked about, including research and evidence base, including production of capacity strengthening materials and advocacy. And so my question is, if this is such an enormous presence of talent and brain and expertise in this room, I think there are 2 types of advocacy we need to talk about. One is to advocate in country by country for legislation, behavior change, all of these things. But another one, we need to advocate for continued funding in this space now. And so who are these, who can finance all of these things that need to happen that you rightfully call out? Because we see our funding. I have been terminating grants with grassroots organizations in the last 5 days. And it is heartbreaking because they're doing amazing work on everything you're talking about, from working with governments to change legislation, to behavior change campaigns for bystanders and perpetrators, to survivor tools and working with survivors. I'll stop talking, but really is a call of desperation, like how can we advocate as a sector maybe for continued funding in the space, and with who?
Good morning. I'm Terry Ince. I'm with the CEDAW Committee of Trinidad and Tobago. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for all of the information that's been shared so far. And I'm particularly interested in the advocacy piece as well. As a country as ours, a small island nation, we are, as you probably are aware, very influenced by faith-based organizations, which is something I haven't heard. Maybe it was covered before I walked in, but that stakeholder group really does influence language and behaviors. So when we're talking about all of these wonderful research that has been done and will continue to be done, I'm hopeful. I wonder what the approach could be, or would you recommend to address that particular demographic, faith-based stakeholders that are definitely influencing not only the members of their congregations, but the legislation that is being put in place. And I was really happy to hear the reference of legislation versus smart legislation, because we have lots of great legislation, but they are not implementable, and they do not address all women in all of our diversity. So just address that, please. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, my name is Norma Buster. I'm the Chief of Staff at C.A. Goldberg, a victims' rights law firm in Brooklyn. Two things, I'll be really quick. The first thing is thinking about smart legislation. This is just a comment. One group of people that's so often excluded from the conversation are sex workers. And I think that it's important to think about, because so many people nowadays have engaged in sex work in some way, whether it was like one time accepting money for a photo and years later they find that the photo ends up on the internet. They deserve the same protection. Same with people who sell intimate content behind a paywall. That should stay behind the paywall. So that's one thing. So many of our laws in the US have clauses in them that specifically have exceptions for content shared in a commercial setting in the first place. But at the end of the day, if we censor consent, then that doesn't align. The other thing is, so that was just a comment. My question is, thinking about engaging with tech companies, our firm has a strictly adversarial relationship with big tech. We sue tech companies, and we believe in accountability to the people that they harm. If you make a dangerous product and it takes someone's life or destroys your life, you deserve to be paid just like any other industry, right? That in the United States, at least. So when tech companies and also like organizations that support digital freedom, as they say, they really challenge these lawsuits. They write amicus briefs in support of the big tech platform. And then they go ahead and like create coalitions to like work with victims' rights groups to try to change the problems that they're creating. So it's just like, why do we even trust them when we get in the room with them, when they've already done so much damage? We've had people getting in rooms with them over the years for so many years. So like, I just don't know why we continue to trust them.
Hi, my name is Megan Sims. I am an IBSA survivor and campaigner from Ireland. I did have a question. I think all of us that have been working in this space, we always talk about laws, but I feel like we focus on the laws so much, sometimes we forget that there's no point having fantastic laws with no enforcement. So I just wanted to ask if anyone had ideas on how to proper enforce the laws that we're passing. Like obviously proper training for police and everything around how to handle sexual violence victims is much needed, but I was just wondering if anyone else had any ideas on how we work on enforcement.
I think we have two more.
Okay, very quickly then. Have a mic over there?
Hi, my name is Cinnamon Love. I work with BIPOC Collective here in New York City with workers. Yeah. Can everyone hear me? Okay, great. Something that I think about often here in the United States, when you register to vote, your voter record, your address is made public. And I'm really interested in how we can expand access to voter registration privacy here in the United States so that survivors can feel safe to vote without risk of having their abusers or traffickers find them, as well as other people who are, looking to stalk them, particularly for folks who are have a large online presence. That access, it facilitates violence in ways that we often don't think about. So I'm really interested in having that conversation about expanding into our organizations, making sure that folks know that that option is available to them.
That was the last question.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Friday Anu from Reach Out Cameroon. I'm the programs director for Reach Out Cameroon. And we do implement a lot of GBV projects, and we adopt a grassroots approach, mainly in rural areas in Cameroon. I'm wondering, what advice will you give for mainstreaming technology in rural areas and bringing technology facilitated GBV prevention in rural communities? Thank you.
Thank you all for the questions. And I'll go back now to the speakers and ask you to address as many as you can, and have your final comments as part of that as well, because we'll be wrapping up. So this is your last chance to share your thoughts. And I'll start with you, Ayesha, and then come back to the room.
Thank you so much, Paula, and thank you everyone for the questions. I will just address the couple that I think are, that I can. There was a question around, I think from Katya, around funding, and I mean, yeah, I'm so sorry that has happened, and we are, in a horrendous phase right now. But you had said, what is there to do? How can we advocate with funders, and who is going to step in? And I mean, I don't think the answers to that are very clear yet. But I think what is clear is that people are stepping in. There has been a sort of surge of solidarity with different types of funders, and we've seen it from people as diverse as, say, the feminist funds, who have, suddenly opened up specific funds for right now for people whose projects have been cancelled, or for specific types of work around resilience, to foundations as big as the MacArthur Foundation suddenly opening a call that they wouldn't have normally had, and adding a percentage of their massive endowment, to increase funding for the year. And we're seeing that sort of thing coming from a lot of different places. And I think it's a tiny little reason for hope, right? That there is this happening, and we need to know where to look. And some of us, including at SVRI, are trying to combine those resources and create something that will help the field, so that projects are not literally being killed as yours has been. And we can share information as we get it. And I would encourage everybody in this room to be doing that, because we're on different platforms, and there is a lot of stuff happening where people are stepping up saying, okay, we're going to try and plug some of these gaps. And so I think some of us just have to be brave enough to go out there and say to funders, okay, we're really desperate now, and are you really going to help? Are you going to step up into this space? So that's just maybe a tiny little bit of hope for now. And then I wanted to pick up on the question around the faith-based work. I mean, it's a huge area of work. At SVRI, we completely agree that the faith-based community is an absolutely essential community in terms of prevention of violence and in terms of responding to violence. They're essential in many communities globally, and there's a fair amount of evidence that actually working through faith-based actors can really work and can have some really important, useful results. Just to flag, we have currently an SVRI Faith and GBV community of practice that is specifically based in Africa. For it's for the African region for now, and it is there to help build an international development community that really understands the role of faith and faith-based actors in gender-based violence prevention and response. So that's just something that you might be interested in. And again, all the resources that we've talked about during this panel, of course, like I will share and make sure that everyone has access to them. And then you were saying, Paula, final comments. So just, I think finally from me, I think we all obviously have a huge role to play in understanding the issues and questioning harmful norms, in making sure that we are aware and we are demanding better protections and we're seeking accountability. But also, as has been brought up during this panel, that we are seeking good alternatives, that sometimes we don't have to keep entering the same spaces where the harm is being created. We seek alternatives, and then we support them by voting with our feet. So that's also part of, I think, what we all need to do. And I think finally, we do know that addressing TFGBV is going to require constant flexibility, constant adaptation, of course, constant investment, and just a relentless focus on what works. So let's keep talking to each other, and let's not leave people out of the conversation, because sometimes we are still in silos. Let's use the evidence-based approaches that we already have and can, that we have the evidence on. And of course, don't ignore the research agenda, because, we love it. And it's a really great piece of work that can help frame your work. It can help frame planning and advocacy with funders to fund what the field really needs and what really, the field has said really matters. And yeah, that is my final word, basically a shameless plug for the TFGBV research agenda. Thank you so much for having me on the panel.
Here, okay. I'm gonna pick up some of the points that I just already laid out perfectly. So participation is key, and meaningful participation. And I think that's attends to a lot of the questions that were presented here. How do we enforce, for example, how do we think about smart legislation? How do we include rural communities throughout participation and meaningful participation? We really do need to highlight meaningful. It's not just a check in the box of some communities were present in which or that discussion. No, when we're talking about meaningful participation, we're talking about participation in all stages of legislation and policy. And by including the communities that are actually more affected by being the implementation of technologies or being the outputs of the legislation or several other intersecting elements, we really are, by including these perspectives, we're advancing onto tailored strategies that would improve the enforcement. So it's all connected, I think that, and it's sadly, one of the issues that we're seeing that is lacking a lot in multilateral spaces. So we do really need to push for meaningful participation and inclusion of marginalized communities within these spaces of discussion. In that sense, also to point out what has been said about the helplines. For example, we have mapped out in Latin America a lot of research regarding helplines that actually give information not only on how to and where can you find the law or process to aim for, but also provide psychological and social support, which I think is one point that we do need to also advance within research and data gathering. Not only what is the main pervasive violence we're seeing, how it's being more affected, but actually how is it impacting socially and economically to the victims. And that also needs to be brought up on in the conversation, which can be also led by meaningful participation. Also regarding the question about engagement with tech, I think it's not about trust. I don't think it's about trust or has ever been about trust. I think it's about necessity, about strategy. And I think that we do need to point out different stages of how this communication has been carried out. Evidently, we are now at the boiling, most terrible part we're seeing right now. But we have been seeing advancements before. Evidently now this has been dismantled. But for example, to give a positive example, some organizations, some digital rights organizations in Latin America have worked with certain tech companies. For example, when we're seeing certain activists that are being harassed online or certain accounts are being blocked, sometimes having a direct line with this, which sometimes they used to have these policy teams that were responding to that issue. So that has worked in the past. That does not mean that this is working now. So we do really need to think about the stages as to articulate out how we're going to push beyond that. And now we're thinking about, again, transparency and accountability as mandatory. And also think about, and I want to end up that, but think about really the complex relationship between regulations when we're thinking about how, this is one of the issues that we're facing in Latin America, how can a country enforce this legislation on tech companies that are operating abroad and that are actually selecting which legislation they're going to comply with. So that is a pervasive issue that we need to take into account now. So we are advancing towards, but it's not about trust or has ever been, just to clarify that. And then just to wrap it up, I do want to point out what I just have said. These spaces are very important to keep talking among each other, to keep generating community, which is something that is so hard within these days because sometimes you feel so overwhelmed as being an activist. And these spaces are really important to keep working towards that. And I'm just going to end up with a positive tune on, just to reference one of my favorite writers in Latin America, Eduardo Galeano. He said, what is utopia good for? Like, what is utopia? When we're talking about like living in a violence-free environment, we can think about it as a utopia, right? So what is utopia for? And he said, well, to keep walking. So let's keep walking, let's keep running towards not only safeguarding the rights we have already accomplished, but really moving forward this agenda and ensuring that we have strength, we have power, we have organization. This is not, we have not lost. We continue to fight. So yeah, thank you.
Great. So I want to first address the point around voter registration and gender-based violence victims. There are certain laws in certain states, but even knowledge of these laws, going through that process is difficult and time-consuming. But the larger problem is actually like data brokers. And so, yeah, maybe you hide your data from the voter registration in your state, but that's already been scraped by data brokers and these online people search sites, which I call stalking as a service sites, because they have all of your home addresses, email addresses, phone numbers, etc. And so I think that there's a big opportunity to eradicate data brokers by focusing on the gender-based violence issue with it. And so would definitely love to chat more about that. In terms of the kind of rural communities, I work with one small nonprofit in Africa, and they've definitely seen it at the schools, right? Working with the schools there. But I would say is like meeting people where they are is something that I think that we can all take, even when we look at like the funding issues. Is I think nonprofits in general are they tend to be legacy, just like journalism is kind of legacy, and it takes a long time for articles to come out. We have to do all of this research versus kind of this new generation where so Garbo, my organization, was wildly successful on TikTok, right? And so being able to just post videos automatically and meet children or teens or wherever where they are, the platforms that they're already using, it doesn't cost money to do these things. It's very easy, and actually the lower budget I think actually goes better to them. And so I think as we move forward and look at, okay, we definitely have reduced funding if we're doing any sort of advocacy, like direct ground trying to talk to people, is utilizing the platforms that we have today and speaking directly to people. And that's where I'm really focused on the next chapter of my work, is saying, okay, like, as we all know, I'm sure in this room, funding takes so much time, the paperwork takes so much time, and that can often get in the way of doing the actual work and pushing things forward. And so for me, it's less about that formal structure of a nonprofit and just trying to say, how do I push these ideas, these movements forward in a way that can just reach more people much, much faster? So I think just be creative, think about the new ideas, and get, you know, young people in the room with us as we look to this next chapter is what I'd say. So
again, thank you to all the speakers. Thank you to all of you here in the room for engaging, for the questions, to all of you online. I was asked to go through a 2-minute, rather arbitrary exercise of trying to summarize the key highlights of this session, so bear with me, I'll try. First, really to recognize the role of grassroots mobilization, campaigns, solidarity and movement building as really the starting point. Then the role of research, evidence, documentation, but with a critical assessment of how and where and when we do our research. The need to measure, but also to understand the differentiated impacts of TFGBV in different communities. So the central role of intersectionality, and to find the responses that are effective to the communities on the ground. The fact that policy and cultural change have to come hand in hand. To really recognize the different forms of oppression and how these different forms of oppression shape the violence that women in all their diversity face. To be aware of easy solutions, like simply criminalizing behavior and how these can backlash against activists. More work on evidence-based prevention, adapt, scale, and fund responses, address critical knowledge gaps, for example, better data on prevalence, the need to also evaluate the impact of the interventions that we are proposing and implementing, to expand the concept of TFGBV and what it looks like in different contexts, including genocide, conflict, and humanitarian, as so many areas in the globe as we are seeing today. Address the fragmented responses, especially in policy making, and adapt mandatory platform accountability through smart legislation, recognizing how tech can be developed to amplify hatred. So the need for design that is addressing that. And then the need for participation of women in the development of technology and in development of policy. So with that, this is just to give you like a food for thought for the upcoming sessions, because we'll have a lot of time to continue these discussions in the panels and in the working groups that we'll have this afternoon. And with that, we'll end the second session of this morning and we'll have a little break. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula, Kathryn, Paloma. We'll just take a quick 15-minute break now, and then we'll come back for a group photo before we move into the next session of the day. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.